Welcome, dear friends and esteemed listeners, as we gather once again around the virtual table of diplomacy and discourse. I'm your host, AR, and it's a pleasure to have your company for a conversation that sits at the heart of modern governance. How do we make better policy decisions when the world itself behaves like a moving target? Across economics, development, climate, health, and security, leaders are often expected to make precise decisions in systems that are anything but precise. Conventional policy design still leans on linear assumptions. One cause, one effect, one intervention, one result. But real systems are interactive, adaptive, and deeply interconnected. They do not move in straight lines. They evolve through feedback. That is where complexity theory becomes valuable. It does not replace evidence, political judgment, or institutional leadership. It strengthens all three by helping us see structure. Who influences whom? What reinforces change? What stabilizes behavior? Where delays distort outcomes? And how small interventions can produce large consequences over time. In complexity-informed policy work, uncertainty is not treated as failure. It is treated as a design condition. The question shifts from, can we predict anything? To, can we design interventions that remain effective across multiple plausible futures? That shift alone improves decision quality in volatile environments. Let's start with a practical definition. A system is a set of elements, institutions, incentives, infrastructure, norms, resources, and actors that interact over time to generate patterns. Those patterns can be growth, stagnation, resilience, instability, or collapse. The key point is that outcomes are produced by interaction, not by any single element operating alone. System dynamics gives policymakers a way to operationalize that insight. It translates assumptions into explicit causal structures and simulation logic. It helps us trace reinforcing loops that accelerate problems, as well as balancing loops that limit change and delays that hide consequences until they become expensive. When system dynamics is paired with grounded inquiry, like historical analysis, stakeholder interviews, field observations, and administrative data, it becomes far more than a technical model. It becomes a bridge between lived reality and strategic design. Qualitative research clarifies behavior and context. Dynamic modeling clarifies trajectory and consequence. This combination is particularly useful when policies have long causal chains. In such settings, success depends less on announcing reforms and more on sequencing, coordination, and adaptation. A policy can be right in principle and still fail in practice if timing, incentives, and institutional capacity are misaligned. So, what does complexity-informed policy practice actually look like? A disciplined approach often includes 5 steps. First, map the system and define boundaries clearly. Second, identify core feedback loops and delays. Third, build and test scenarios rather than relying on one forecast. Fourth, implement with monitoring indicators tied to assumptions. And fifth, adapt quickly when indicators diverge from expected behavior. None of this requires abandoning accountability. In fact, it strengthens accountability because assumptions are made explicit. When policies are tied to explicit causal logic and measurable signals, decision makers can explain not only what they chose, but why they chose it, and under what conditions they will adjust course. To make this concrete, let's examine 3 case studies. Each illustrates a distinct systemic lesson. We are not repeating one template 3 times. Instead, we are looking at 3 different forms of complexity: network contagion, incentive misalignment, and delayed feedback under uncertainty. Case Study 1: The 2008 Financial Crisis and the Logic of Network Contagion. Before the crisis, much of financial governance focused on the health of individual institutions. If each firm appeared compliant, the broader system was assumed to be stable. Yet, the crisis revealed a structural blind spot. Systemic fragility can emerge even when many individual entities appear sound in isolation. The core issue was interdependence. Institutions were linked through funding markets, as well as derivative exposure, collateral chains, and confidence-sensitive liquidity behavior. A shock in one segment did not stay local. It traveled through network ties, repriced risk across markets, and triggered synchronized defensive behavior. The unique systemic lesson here is this: in tightly coupled systems, stability is a network property, not an individual property. You can have many seemingly prudent actors whose collective interaction still produces systemic collapse. System dynamics and network-oriented analysis helped policymakers move from institutional-level diagnosis to system-level stress logic. Instead of asking only, "Is bank A solvent?" they asked, "How does distress in A change behavior in B, C, and D through funding channels, collateral values, and confidence effects?" This perspective exposed reinforcing loops that amplified crisis. Asset fire sales depressed prices. Lower prices weakened balance sheets. Weaker balance sheets triggered further deleveraging. Liquidity strain and confidence erosion fed one another. Without intervention, these loops escalated rapidly. Policy response became more structural as a result. Authorities expanded stress testing to account for correlated exposures, strengthened macroprudential safeguards, increased attention to shadow channels, and emphasized resilience buffers that address system-wide risk propagation rather than single-point failure. Equally important, policymakers learned that emergency interventions must be paired with structural reforms. Short-term stabilization can stop immediate contagion, but if underlying connectivity risk, opacity, and incentive distortions remain, fragility simply reaccumulates. So, the financial crisis did more than validate the need for oversight. It changed the unit of analysis. It taught policymakers to treat interconnection itself as a source of risk, and therefore a central object of governance. Case Study 2: Deforestation and the Architecture of Incentives. Environmental policy often begins with visible remedies: reforestation campaigns, isolated protection zones, and periodic enforcement surges. These actions can be meaningful, but in many contexts, deforestation persists because visible interventions target symptoms, while incentive architecture remains unchanged. In forest systems, land use behavior is shaped by overlapping drivers, such as commodity demand, road expansion, tenure insecurity, weak enforcement credibility, long-term income pressure, and policy fragmentation across agriculture, infrastructure, finance, and local development. The unique systemic lesson in this case is not contagion. It is policy incoherence through incentive misalignment. When ministries and market signals reward expansion while conservation agencies attempt containment, the system produces predictable leakage. For example, transport policy may improve road access for economic growth, while land governance remains weak. The result can be accelerated land speculation and frontier conversion, even as national discourse celebrates conservation goals. In this pattern, policy does not fail because no one acted. It fails because different parts of the state acted in different causal directions. System dynamics helps policymakers map these cross-sector interactions explicitly. It can reveal where economic pressure overwhelms conservation signals, where enforcement delays reduce deterrence, and where subsidy structures unintentionally reward clearing rather than stewardship. This modeling perspective also clarifies trade-offs over time. A strict ban without livelihood alternatives may increase illegal extraction. A subsidy without monitoring may be captured by actors already driving degradation. A conservation pledge without tenure reform may exclude local communities and weaken legitimacy. More effective strategies, therefore, combine policy instruments rather than relying on single interventions. These can include secure land rights, incentive-compatible production standards, enforcement that is predictable rather than episodic, financing for sustainable livelihoods, and supply chain transparency that shifts market behavior. In short, the deforestation case teaches that systemic change requires alignment across institutions and incentives. Ecology responds to governance structure. If policy architecture is fragmented, ecological outcomes will mirror that fragmentation. Case Study 3: Water Scarcity and Delayed Feedback Governance. Water systems presents a different challenge. Unlike financial contagion, water stress often accumulates gradually. Aquifers decline over years. Infrastructure deteriorates quietly. Demand patterns shift incrementally. And climate variability compounds pressure. Because deforestation is slow at first, political urgency is often delayed. The distinct systemic lesson here is delayed feedback and threshold risk. Systems can appear manageable for long periods, then cross tipping points where adaptation becomes expensive, socially contentious, and technically difficult. In many regions, policymakers confront a difficult reality. Short political cycles reward immediate benefits, while water resilience requires long horizon investment and disciplined demand management. Without explicit dynamic planning, this mismatch produces recurring crisis governance, like late interventions, emergency restrictions, and uneven social impacts. System dynamics can help by integrating long-run variables, like population growth, sectorial demand, pricing structures, infrastructure capacity, rainfall variability, and climate scenarios. Instead of treating scarcity as a seasonal anomaly, policymakers can model structural pressure and evaluate intervention durability. This reveals where apparently rational short-term choices create long-term fragility. Subsidized overuse may protect affordability now, but accelerate depletion later. Delayed infrastructure upgrades may save budget today, but multiply losses under drought stress. Allocation rules that ignore equity can stabilize supply for some sectors, while destabilizing social trust overall. A complexity-informed water strategy typically combines multiple levers: demand efficiency, infrastructure modernization, leakage reduction, adaptive allocation protocols, diversified supply planning, and social protections for vulnerable households and small producers. Just as important is trigger-based governance. Rather than waiting for visible crisis, governments can define early warning thresholds tied to reservoir levels, as well as groundwater trends and forecast indicators. Crossing thresholds automatically activates pre-agreed policy responses, improving speed, credibility, and fairness. Water governance also benefits from participatory modeling. Farmers, utilities, municipalities, and industry often hold different mental models of scarcity. Shared dynamic frameworks create a common evidence base, reducing conflict and improving the feasibility of coordinated action. Taken together, these three cases underscore why complexity work must be tailored. Financial systems demand attention to contagion through connectivity. Forest systems demand alignment of cross-sector incentives. Water systems demand governance that respects delay, uncertainty, and threshold effects. Same analytical family, different design logic. Before we close, let's translate this into implementation language for policy teams. A practical starting move is to convene a cross-ministerial mapping session around one priority issue and require each agency to identify the feedback loops they influence. This immediately surfaces hidden interdependence that standard briefing notes tend to miss. A second move is to establish a policy simulation sprint before major reform announcements. The goal is not to produce perfect predictions. It is to expose high-risk pathways, distribunal impacts, and likely adaptation behavior among affected actors. Even a modest simulation process can prevent costly blind spots. A third move is governance design. Assign ownership not only for implementation tasks, but for assumption tracking. If a policy assumes stable prices, compliance rates, or rainfall patterns, those assumptions should have named institutional owners and monitoring triggers. This turns adaptation from improvisation into protocol. The fourth move is communication discipline. Complexity-informed policy can sound abstract unless framed in plain language. Leaders should communicate three things clearly: what the policy is designed to change, what uncertainty remains, and what indicators will trigger adjustment. That honesty builds legitimacy, especially during volatility. Finally, capacity building matters. Teams need basic system thinking literacy, not just external consultants. Over time, governments that institutionalize dynamic analysis through training, reusable model libraries, and interagency learning forums make faster, smarter corrections and reduce repeated policy failure cycles. Now, No serious discussion of system dynamics is complete without addressing criticism. Critics correctly point out that models rely on assumptions, and assumptions can be wrong. Data may be incomplete, especially in low-capacity settings. Institutional teams may lack technical resources to build and maintain robust models. And if models are treated as objective truth rather than structured judgment, they can create false confidence. These are valid concerns. The answer is methodological discipline, not abandonment. Good practice requires explicit documentation of boundaries, assumptions, uncertainty ranges, and sensitivity tests. It also requires continuous updating as new data and implementation feedback emerge. Another concern is oversimplification. Real societies contain power asymmetries, informal institutions, and cultural dynamics that equations can't miss. That is why model development should include plural expertise and grounded qualitative evidence. Models should inform political decision-making, not replace it. Bias is also a risk. Who defines system boundaries? Which outcomes are prioritized? Which actors are represented? These choices shape conclusions. Transparent participatory design, external review, and iterative validation are essential safeguards. When these safeguards are in place, system dynamics offers practical advantages. Clearer trade-off analysis, stronger interagency coordination, earlier detection of policy side effects, and better communication of uncertainty to the public and to decision makers. It also improves pacing. Instead of oscillating between overconfidence and panic, institutions can move through deliberate learning cycles. Test, implement, monitor, adapt. That rhythm is especially important in an era of overlapping crisis, where policy fatigue is real and attention is scarce. So let's close on this central takeaway. Complexity-informed policymaking is not about producing perfect forecasts. It's about building adaptive capacity. It asks institutions to think structurally, act iteratively, and coordinate across boundaries that traditional governance often treats as separate. If we do this well, policy becomes more resilient, more transparent, and more humane. We reduce the odds of solving one problem while quietly worsening another. We improve our ability to navigate uncertainty without surrendering strategic direction. In a century shaped by climate stress, financial volatility, we reduce the odds of solving one problem while quietly worsening another. We improve our ability to navigate uncertainty while surrendering strategic direction. In a century shaped by climate stress, financial volatility, demographic change, technological disruption, and geopolitical interdependence, this is not a luxury framework. It is a governance necessity. And perhaps the deepest value of this approach is cultural. It trains institutions to reward learning over denial, coordination over siloed optimization, and long-term stewardship over short-term political optics. That institutional mindset is often the difference between repeated crisis management and durable public resilience. Thank you for your continued support and thoughtful engagement with Diplomacy and Discourse. If this episode resonated with you, please subscribe, share the conversation, and leave a review on your preferred podcast platform. As always, we welcome your reflections, questions, and suggestions at diplomacyanddiscourse@gmail.com. Your voice helps shape the direction of this series. Until our next encounter, take care, stay curious, and keep exploring the systems beneath the surface of world events.